Thank you. That was a lovely introduction. I am very happy to be asked, particularly by students who are our future, to present. This is a topic that I'm being asked to speak a lot about. I don't know if it's because of my age or because I've responded to structural racism in so many interesting ways, some of which I'll share with you. I invite you to ask me questions. So please write them down so that once I get through us, we can have a rigorous discussion. You don't have to agree with everything that I say or think or feel, but I would like to hear it expressed in a respectful way. You can't imagine why I need to say that to people because I've been called everything all out of my name because of my history and because I speak truth to power. That's the only way I want to live. If I couldn't do that, I don't think I would be a psychologist. So this is an emotional experience, so you have to forgive. If you hear my voice, you'll know that it's hard for me to talk about some of these things. I'm doing them because I want you to learn from me. I want you to grow from me. I want you to realize my pain. And I want you to also be inspired by the fact that when you set your mind to something and you have the right kind of environment and encouragement, you can do amazing things. So I want to thank my ancestors and my parents, who you'll see in just a moment, for raising my sister and me in the way that they did. That was really impervious to racism. They told us we could do anything, and we tried our best. So without further ado, you see what I'm doing at UCLA, but mostly what you don't see is just how few people of color there are in the Department of Psychiatry. I've been there for 46 years, and yet there are fewer than 5 people of color in that department. And we have a lot of work to do in many, many schools of medicine. This is where I'm located, but many, many universities, which I think are the melting pot for where critical thinking ought to be, but it cannot exist when you have 1 or 2 people leading those conversations or contradicting what's being said or done. It's exhausting and often discourages me for a moment, but I'm never discouraged for too long. So, okay, Josh, if you will advance my slides. I want to also thank my team, the Center for Culture, Trauma, and Mental Health Disparities. We were funded by National Institute of Mental Health in 2006, and we've been rolling ever since. We are a multi-ethnic, multidisciplinary team of men and women and trans people. So we do reflect America. I like to work with people who look different from me, but also I like to look at some people who look just like me and also have experienced my truth and my pain. It's very comforting, and many times I have an island at UCLA. Please come and visit me. I'm on the 3rd floor in the Department of Psychiatry. I often don't leave that area. I'm not there at all, of course, right now, and haven't been since March, when probably the rest of you were told to go home. But we have been given permission to go back to campus, though we do research in South Los Angeles and Los Angeles County. We do keep our data at UCLA, so we come and go, but we do obey the rules. All right, next slide. I also want to thank David, Josh, Emily, and Rachel for making it possible for me to come. I don't know that all of you have heard of me or my work or just read anything. So this is a great opportunity to spread the word. And I especially appreciate the fact that students had a great deal to do with it, and they're all here. That also means a lot, that all 4 people were here. Sometimes I'm invited and I never meet the people that invite me. That says a lot to me about how important it is for me to be there. So the fact that all of you are here means a lot. So thank you. All right, here we go. So I was born in Texas. My dad and my mother were teachers. My dad was a musician, quite outstanding. He composed, directed, wrote music, And he had a band on the weekend, and my sister and I sang. You'll see a little of that in a minute. And my mother was an English teacher. She also had a very heavy music background because her dad was a Methodist minister and a bishop. And so I had a very wonderful introduction to the importance of culture and education. My parents taught and chose to teach in an area of Los Angeles, Compton and Watts, where people usually enter Los Angeles. The area is very economically poor. Mostly now Latinos have replaced African Americans. African Americans have moved to another area of Los Angeles mostly, but they chose to work there because they knew that there's so many young people with talent would come through, and they had an influence on so many young people. They also had an influence on us. That's my sister Sandra and me. Every summer of our lives, since my parents were not working, they had the summers free, we traveled in the car to see our relatives in the South and in Chicago and New York. So that meant, as well as Texas. And so that meant that in traveling, I was raised in a segregated America, so we could not eat at any restaurants and we could not sleep in any hotels. So my parents tried to convert the car. When we first started, there was no air conditioning, so you know what that must have been like. They would convert the car to as comfortable a place for us to be for 5 days, up to 5 days as possible. And my mother used to fry chicken and boil eggs. And so that's what we ate in the car until we got to a home of a friend or friend of a friend, where we would spend the night. That usually took about 3 days for us to get to someplace. If for something fell through, then we wouldn't stop. So we often were in the car on the side of the road, which is really terrifying. My sister had very bad asthma, and on one occasion, she was so sick that we were really afraid. She just couldn't breathe. It was sweltering hot and humid, and so we made a decision that we would get a motel room so that she could sleep in a bed for the night. So my mother drove, my father hid under the hood in the car, in the passenger side, so that he couldn't be seen. Maybe for obvious reasons. He was brown skinned, she was fair skinned, and we were able to get a room. She went in, got the room, she and I did, and my father and my sister hid. This was a really degrading experience for my family because they're both second generation college educated people, and to have to hide, and we were terrified all night that we'd be found out and thrown out and my sister wouldn't get a chance to get better. That's just one of countless experiences that we had, many around sleeping, eating, and going to the bathroom because we just couldn't figure all of that out every trip that we were included in. When we got to be young teens, which was around the time that this picture was taken, and the reason I wanted you to see it was we were standing in front of a car. You cannot get me in a car for any distance today because of the experiences that I had. I don't want to travel in a car anymore. It was traumatic. I saw a lot. I saw the whole world. They literally showed us the whole world, but those kind of experiences just really terrified me. And the other experience I had was my mother bought a little porta potty. Now, I don't know where she got it. And you know, they're selling them again today. But we would stop, my father would look away, she would have the car door open, and we would go to the bathroom in this little porta potty. And then when we got to be what they call young ladies, we didn't want to go to the bathroom like that anymore. And we fought my parents because they didn't want to stop at a filling station. We were traumatized enough just by trying to get gas because they would decide whether they wanted to give us gas or not because my parents were two different colors. So the level of segregation, the level of discrimination, the level of degradation was so deep that, of course, you know, we didn't have any idea and they were trying to protect us. Well, they finally said, okay, let's stop and let you go to the bathroom. We didn't have any idea what we were getting into. So we walked behind the filling station and there were three bathrooms. One was for colored, the other one was for white women, and the third was for white men. So we were heading for the white women bathroom, and my mother said, oh no, you have to go to the colored bathroom. So that just opened up a whole conversation that we really never had before, and they had managed to avoid. And that is what it meant to the part of the world that didn't know our family, that we were a Black family. And that colored bathroom had no toilet paper. My mother had toilet paper, but it had none, and it was filthy. So we started to cry, and while we were standing there trying to decide if we were going to go back to the porta potty or not, we went on to the bathroom. There was a little white girl and her mother who headed to the white women's bathroom. And we looked at her, and by that time my mother was crying. So all three of us cried through that bathroom bout. When we got back to the car, my father was crying because he knew what we had seen. And we were all upset. No one could talk. No one could really put into words what that experience was like, but I never forgot it. And I've talked about it at the American Psychological Association many, many times when people wanted to know what it was like growing up in segregated America and what I took from it. And that is that, you know, in order to survive these kinds of experiences, that you've got to be well insulated with a family that can teach you self-pride and who you are and treat you and protect you as much as they can, but they can't. You have to talk about it. You have to get it out. You have to get your anger out, or else your anger will be directed in inappropriate and very dangerous ways. We see that evidence today, but we'll talk about that later on. All right, next slide. So some years passed growing up, and by the time we were 10 and 12, we were really accomplished musicians because of my dad's exposure and my mom's. We played violin together, we sang in harmony, and we danced. So one day at the dance studio where we took lessons, some scouts for Disney came along, and they wanted to see, you know, who could do what. And they liked my sister and me. They asked us to bring our violin next time. So we showed them all that we could do musically, and they invited us to be on the Mickey Mouse Club. We were over the moon. And obviously my mother shopped. She was a great shopper, God bless her. And she bought us these little matching outfits, as you can see. I was 10, my sister was 12, and we sang. I didn't want to show you the whole video because I really wanted to share with you my research, and we could talk about my past all day. But this is just the end of the program that you can see. The Mouseketeers were giving us our Western hats and our ears, right? But the ears were to be an honorary Mouseketeer. So what I'm trying to show you in this first part of my life is that I lived in structural racism. We could be as talented, and we were, but it didn't matter. We could only be honorary Mouseketeers. That was a devastating experience. My mother was there, and she explained it again, though she had explained it before. We just were in disbelief that these kids didn't speak to us, but we thought maybe they were just busy. And my mother said, no, they're not too busy to speak to you. You can never be too busy to greet someone. And we spoke and we smiled, but they never responded to us. But on screen, they were very warm and friendly. And so that wasn't real. And we had to talk about that. When people are disingenuous, they can say one thing out of one side of their mouths, but their behavior says something else. And it doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to us, except we'd been exposed to it every summer. So we were used to racism. We knew what it meant, but we were determined not to let it limit our lives. And as I said, my parents then started international travel. So I did have an opportunity to see a great deal of the world before I was 14 years old, and went on with other groups to Europe and other parts of the world. So well-educated, well-traveled, well-experienced, and well-immersed in what it meant to be an African-American. Okay, next slide. I've always had an abiding interest in Black women. My mother was an amazing woman. Not only did she teach, she brought home almost all the class. She clothed them, she fed them, she taught young girls how to walk and talk. My father did the same for boys, as well as teaching kids how to play instruments. These were all things that gave people something to do and something to enhance how they felt about themselves. I was really very curious and kind of bookish, wanted to know, where were the Black women that I read so much about and heard so much about? They didn't seem to be the women in my neighborhood or the people that were in my mother's family. We were never babysat. We were babysat by teachers. And when my mother was sick or couldn't take us to school, her friends who were teachers took us. And then she would stay home if some of their children were sick. So we were completely nested in a very protective environment all through our lives until we got to college. But Ida B. Wells really piqued my interest in not only the fact that, Black women hadn't had a history of ever having the kind of decision-making around their own bodies, but the effects of oppression really weren't taught. I didn't see them included in anything that I read in psychology. The decision-making skills around health and sexuality, I didn't see. And yet we always heard about and read about high numbers of sexually transmitted infections, and then HIV, now COVID. And then the awareness for prevention seemed to be very unidimensional, so that everybody got the same mention. That was troubling to me because I knew the history of African descended people. Next slide. So there's a growing literature today. One article written by Michael Mensah, who's a psychiatry resident in the New England Journal of Medicine, and I think it was last month, who wrote about the minority tax. And I don't know if any of you are aware of it, but there is a tax that you pay if you move out of your designated role as a pretty much oppressed and silent person with mental health and all kinds of substance abuse problems. So my tax was, of course, given to me differently because I aspired to be a psychologist at the age of 14. I never changed my mind and I never looked back, even though I didn't even see a Black female psychologist until I got to Fisk University, which is a historically Black college in Nashville, Tennessee. I graduated, engaged to be married, which was the thing to do. I don't know if it still is. My granddaughter tells me, no, it is not the thing to do. But I was engaged and I'm married 2 months after college. My husband was in medical school, which was right across the street, Meharry Medical College. And so I wanted to get my PhD before I got engaged and wanted to just go to school in Nashville, but no school would take me. Except this. So I got a master's degree instead of starting on my PhD when I finished. I was 20 years old when I graduated college. And when he graduated in 2 years, I had my master's degree, he had his MD, and we had a 3-month-old little son, Lance. We thought we were hot stuff. So we weren't, because we went to Baltimore, Maryland. And if you know anything about Baltimore, it is as segregated and racist, and certainly was then. And we were just amazed that we could not negotiate very well, even though we had all these special degrees. It did not matter. But that's another story, and I'm not telling that one unless you have some questions about racism we encountered in Baltimore. I was beginning to see that in America, we were treated differently than we were in Europe or in other parts of the world. That was for sure. But coming back to my story, I did get a PhD at UCLA and started to look around for something that would allow me to get more research experience and to look at some of the things that I was curious about. I discovered a K award, but I was told it was not for me. But I couldn't read anything that said it was not for me. So I called Washington, called NIH, and I asked them, could someone who had a PhD apply? And they said they were silent. And they said, well, who are you? And this and that and the other. I thought they were probably trying desperately to find out, what was my ethnicity. And they knew I was a woman. But anyway, they said they didn't see anything that would prohibit me applying. They never said yes, they just never said no. So I applied. I wrote my K Award 4 times for 4 years. And what I learned from that experience was, in order to get a K Award, you had to have an R01. Well, this would have been my first grant, but I had to have an R01 in order to support the research I wanted to do, was on the sexual experience of Afro-American women. That was the term we used in those days. So I submitted myself to reviews, in-person reviews. They would come, all of the reviewers who read your grant would come and question you for a couple of hours and then decide whether you get the award or not. So one particular time I was standing by the elevator, and as I saw the committee members come out, my eyes welled up. I knew I wasn't going to get it that time because all of the people who did research in sexuality were on my review committee. And I had reviewed them very negatively. Of course, been very critical about the way in which they handled Black female sexuality, that they had very unrepresentative samples. In the Kinsey study, which was at the time still being used as kind of the gold standard, they interviewed Black women who were farm workers and generalized to the entire population. This is back in the 40s. So I decided, that I wanted to bring all of those studies up to date and learn how to be a sex researcher. And so that would be my main reason for getting a K Award. Well, after 4 years, I think I wore them down. I was awarded it and I got an R01. My very first grant was an R01. So I was off and running until I was sat down by people at NIH and told that I was not to publish until I was told to publish. Because now this was during the Reagan administration, and Reagan would never have approved my grant, Sexual Experience of African American Women, no way. So they changed the title of my grant to something that had to do with mothers and children. It had no ethnic reference whatsoever. So they said, you just simply cannot be visible until we tell you to be. So I was a happy camper because I got my funding and I was off developing questions to be asked in my studies until 1984. I got all these grants in 1980, so I've been continuously funded since 1980 by NIH or some private foundation or state funds or somebody, but I've never experienced not being funded since then. That's a pretty cool record. But one of my advisors for my K told me that if I didn't want to be reviewed negatively for my grants by people who either didn't appreciate my criticisms of the research, make them consultants on my grant so they could have a conflict of interest and they wouldn't be able to review me. My review committee would be somebody that I didn't write about, but they wouldn't certainly be the people who didn't want me to publish because I would be contradicting and criticizing them. So I learned a great lesson very early on, and that is all your enemies should be consultants on your projects so they cannot hurt you. Next slide. More of the taxes. When I got my PhD, I was offered a job. I thought it was because I was talented, young. That was not it. I satisfied 2 quotas, and they had quotas. A certain number of women had to be hired in every department, certain number of African Americans. I took up 2 slots, so I was hired as an assistant professor. I had no orientation, had no idea what job I was to have. All I knew was that I'd be an assistant professor. My family was thrilled. I could not tell my grandfather, the minister, that I was also looking at human sexuality. That was not appropriate for a young lady. So I simply told him that I taught. And he was happy, and he died thinking that I was a teacher at UCLA. I'm slipping in little cultural tidbits, so I'm hoping that you'll ask me about some of these. 2 years later, I decided I wanted to get my license exam. There were no African Americans who were licensed in the state of California. I studied with a couple of Jewish women who had passed the exam, and I went in for my license. I was in a hotel. Can you imagine the licensing exam? The variable part was in a hotel. I stood in the room. They sat on the beds. There were 3 white men. and they kept me in there for 45 minutes. If I didn't pass that just because I wasn't traumatized enough, I don't know how I managed, but I passed that test and went home and made a little ball in my bed. I was so frightened. I was so disgusted, but I passed it. And from that point on, I made a commitment to study with and help every person who wanted to pass that test. And I can say I don't want to be the only person many times that walks in and opens the door, but when I'm opening it, I never close it. I try to help somebody else. Next slide. These are things I didn't have to do, but things I did have to do. So I shared with Rachel and I shared with Emily how disgusted I was when I started reading some of the research in psychology, because some of the things were told me when I was sat down and told not to publish. I was also told in order to get that first R01 that I had to have a white control group, that they were the standard, and that who would I be comparing Black women to if I didn't have a white control group? I had no clue as to what they were talking about. I was going to talk about African-American women and look at different experiences by income, by neighborhood, by socialization, which I did, but I also had to do that for the white control group that I was forced to include. All the way through the years, when I started I got the academic appointment in 1973, and then by 74, I started being mistaken for someone in the domestic team at UCLA, and that has happened to this day. My assistant and I will stand if someone new comes looking for me, if they haven't looked me up, we stand together and they immediately look for her. So that's implicit bias, and they begin to talk to her as if she's Dr. Wyatt, and I just stand there to see how long will it take before they figure out she doesn't know the answer to any of the questions that she's being asked. She's simply white. So this has not changed. And it's disgusting for me to have to tell you this. It's disgusting to be treated this way. I've been handed papers in the hall when I was on the elevator, said, would you throw this away from me? Would you open my door? Would you do anything? But I'm not mistaken for being a professor. I didn't see any role models who do what I do. I didn't see any Black women who had research teams. Much of my life has been involved with wanting to be something that I'd never seen before and having to be the first one to do it. I didn't have any mentors and who looked like me, but I did have other people who were kind enough to mentor me. And I have many mentors. I've got ethnic mentors, I've got female mentors, I've got married mentors, I got mentors with children. I've got all kinds of people at different points in their lives who allow me to tell my story and help me to get to the next level. And I have to thank all of them, because you can't have one person in your life giving you direction. There isn't anybody who was doing what I did. So I had to be very creative and find the people who could help me. Next slide. And some of them were men. More examples of explicit bias. I also was told not to publish in the Journal of Black Psychology. I think that was mentioned as maybe one of the people that's going to come and speak, but I was told not to publish in any ethnic journals. I was the second editor of the Journal of Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology. I was a part of that whole group who insisted that we have our own ethnic journal in APA. And so that was a huge responsibility. I read over 500 and edited 500 articles in the span of time that I was a journal editor. I will not do that again, but I did do it. I gave back, I helped other people. But there have been some experiences I've never had, and I don't think I ever will. One is to be on the NIH Council, making decisions about which grants actually get funded or which decisions that are made that I might disagree with. Or the HTPNs, any of the HTPNs. I've never been invited to be at that level, even though I have made more money than some of the individuals, done more cutting edge research, never been invited to sit. Okay, next slide, please. So maybe these are some of the reasons. I am outspoken, as you might guess. And I would certainly say to them that I think it's inappropriate for them to go to other countries and use Black African women as guinea pigs and not even offer them the medications that they are testing on them. if they're found to be effective. Some of those behaviors have changed over time, but they should never have been approved at all. They wouldn't do that in America, but they would do it in other countries. I have huge issues on the ethics of how research has been conducted, and many psychologists sitting right there in the room who said nothing. So it was important to me to go back and to look at my experience and to look to see what was missing from research and why were some of these research findings so tepid, so minor. And I truly believe that it's because we don't ask the right questions of people of color. Culture is not asked about, and I think it's not asked about because many people who don't have that lived experience don't know. Although it's not ever endorsed that you have to know culture, I believe it is that you do. And so anyone supervised by me gets this whole dose, the dose of everything you've heard about this morning, except the Mickey Mouse part. I don't share that with everybody. But cultural competence is it's a term that everyone uses, but they don't know that it's not relevant to things, it's relevant to people and has a lot to do with history and knowledge of the culture. And I believe that's why it is missing from a lot of the interventions, though we include it in ours. And cultural congruence is what we use in our approaches. And that comes from understanding what people are familiar with. What do they understand? Even their healthy paranoia, things that they're skeptical of, that we talk about and we acknowledge in our interventions so that people don't think that we don't know just how poorly they've been treated. Actually, we start there and we go from there, building that kind of trust and respect based on the fact that we know people of color have not been well treated and they still aren't. Next slide. So we have a couple of interventions. This is just the Abban project. This was a national study of African-American men and women in relationships and how we used African terminology and African concepts with each of the series. It's well published, well used. All of the investigators were invited by NIH and me to participate in New York, in Atlanta, in Philadelphia, and in Los Angeles. I was the PI of the Los Angeles team. And so we created an intervention that allowed couples, one who was HIV positive and the other who wasn't. So obviously they were at risk. They weren't using any form of protection to stay together. And we actually reinforced the fact that they were together. That was extremely important, whereas so many other interventions encourage people who find out the status of their partners to leave their partner. But amongst African Americans, establishing and keeping relationships is something that we wanted to work on, we wanted to encourage. We wanted to teach them how to be healthy and how to be safe, but also how to be in love with the person that they were in love with. And, you know, in psychology, I just have to stop because I see a sister and her name is Amanda. And thank you, Amanda, for being here. I see somebody like myself. Thank you for being here this morning. It's extremely important that we honor the things that we want to promote in African Americans, and that's being in relationships and knowing how to be in ones that are risky. We have huge health issues. That doesn't mean breaking up. That means staying together and teaching each other how to stay healthy. Next slide, please. I wanted you to see one of my very first articles. This is so old. We had time trying to find it. When you print it out, and I have some copies of it, it's yellow. The pages are yellow, but I keep it because it keeps me humble. This was a couple. It was like kind of a case study. Richard Strayer was the guy, white guy, who invited me to take sex therapy training lessons with him. I thought he was hitting on me. I had no idea what sex therapy was. And of course I had to run home and read about it. But there was a very new program at UCLA, the Department of Psychiatry. So they were training sex therapists. This all had to do with why I was so interested in learning how to do sex research. And Dick was just a regular hippie kind of guy, wore Birkenstock sandals. I know guys like that still exist. They haven't changed. His hair was long. He never washed it. But he was the coolest guy. And we did therapy together. The deal we made was we could see Black couples, and he wanted to see hippie couples. So we made a pact with each other that we would make sure we got experience seeing the kind of couples we want to see in our practices later on. Long story short, this was a young couple who wanted therapy. She wanted to be taught how to be promiscuous, and I'm not kidding. And he wanted to be taught how to be a stud. That was just so intriguing to me that I wanted to see them in therapy. So we did. And this is their story in this first article. I just wanted you to see that when you get excited about your clinical experience, you can write it up. So you're doing both at the same time. You're publishing and you're also learning clinically and hopefully helping people. So I wanted to find out how and what did they read that would tell them to be a stereotype. And essentially, this is what that article talks about. They read articles, they had looked at movies, and that's all they saw was promiscuous Black women and Black men that just had tons of partners, long genitalia that were just enormous in size. And this guy said, you know, this is what I want to be. This is a stud in my mind. I couldn't believe it. And we, of course, had to teach them that that's not real. That was a stereotype. What they needed to do is communicate what they wanted with each other, be respectful, decide what they did and did not want to do, respect that, and learn how to enjoy each other. They went on to a longer relationship and got married and had kids, settled down. And I have to say, I'd love to see them again. I don't know where they went, but all I know is that these stereotypes are so pervasive and they're so well entrenched in the literature that you can see it and read it today. Next slide, please. I also found, and I don't know where I got this from in a religious family that I'm from, that sex is fluid. It's not dichotomous. Now, you may know that because you're young, but if you're my age, you didn't know it. If you're a male, you were male, and you were female, you know, that kind of thing, and you didn't veer out of it. And if you did, something was wrong with you, you need to be in therapy or in an institution. Next slide, please. And so when I developed the Wyatt Sex History Questionnaire, I talked about females who had sexual experiences with women and men. It made sense to me that that could happen. Where did I get that from? Reading about slavery. And you have to know that our history, if you go back and read it, you'll find all the things that we're struggling with politically today. They were happening then. They weren't handled very well, but they were happening. These have been real life experiences that I knew happened because of my parents and their education and their insistence that we read and know who we were. And because in the people that I saw in my clinical practice, they talked about these experiences with such shame and embarrassment. And so I felt like, you know, in the interviews that we gave for research, we needed to ask both experiences. And I was really honored that some people went back and looked at my work and said, you know, wow, you were really, you know, ahead of your game. Yeah, I really was. Even though my grandfather would roll over in his grave if he knew what I was actually doing in therapy. But I really found great pride in letting people be who they were, talking about those experiences. And interestingly, many of them had histories of sexual abuse. So what we tried to do was to sort out those non-consensual experiences that may have given them an idea that they liked sex a certain way, and push those aside and allow them to have their own experiences and make their own decisions about themselves. Next slide, please. So it was also important for me to integrate culture into the affective and the cognitive approaches to sexuality and sexual health. You know, I have a program, the Sexual Health Program, where we teach young college students about sex, which is hilarious. I'll tell you about that if you ask during questions and answers. But next slide, please. I want to show you what I did develop, and that's the sexual health model. This has to do with what I feel is essential in order to grow up healthy. I'll start with body awareness, that you have to know the parts of the body. You have to know the terminology. You have to know what each of those body parts does and what it means. And you have to have some idea about the opposite sex, whether you have sex with them or not. You have to know this kind of experience and how the body changes over time, over life, over health is extremely important too. Sexual ownership has to do with all of the experiences that you have. Some can't be a secret. They all have to be talked about. you have to have responsibility for them. And I really found that people with histories of abuse and trauma would leave out talking about rape, talking about sexual exploitation, and ownership means that you talk about all these experiences and learn how to manage them in your lives. Interconnected is totally cultural. And it means that you're connected to somebody else. And that's why the initial introduction of slaves to this country was so traumatic, because they separated people by language, by tribe or nation, and by family, so that you didn't know anyone who spoke like you, and you didn't know anyone. Aloneness is one of the most catastrophic things that you can do to a person who's been oppressed, making them feel alone, different, and that they don't see each other. They have no one to connect with. So the fact that I am because we are is an important part of the clinical experience, and it's a clinical healing point in therapy with people who have been oppressed, not just because of their sexuality, because of who they are, to be connected with someone else. And interestingly, when I went to South Africa over 16 years ago, and I started doing research, I found the concept of Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U. It means the same thing. So I have got to believe that somebody in my ancestry was talking to me and saying that interconnectedness has a deeper connection than you know to who you are. Because I certainly know that the fact that I had a strong family and was very connected, and I still am, with my family and with my friends, has been my balm when I'm low, when I feel less than, and then they can lift me right back up and put me on my feet. But this is important to understanding who a person is, and they have a reason for the sexual health that they develop. Next slide, please. It's also important, and I think I've mentioned this, to understand how to ask about those experiences that you don't want to happen. We're still grappling with this in America when we talk about rape on college campuses, or rape of children, or rape of men. It's been so difficult for men to accept the fact that they can be raped too. They can have non-consensual experiences that don't have to define who they are sexually. So next slide, please. So I've developed a series of questions that are now being used all over the world, and I'm really proud of these. They were not easy to come up with. I'm not going to read them. If you're interested in them, you can get the slides. You can get the whole questionnaire. There are many, many other questions, but I do start with a framing of what we're expecting people to respond to, and then the questions themselves. Next slide, please. Just so that you can see the kind of in-depth questions that we ask about it. And I have to define the terms, because you do not know what a person means when they talk about sexual abuse. When you talk about rape, you have to be behaviorally oriented. So you have to use in terms body parts to describe what it is that you want a person to respond to, or you'll get all kinds of answers. And when we do sexuality studies in different countries, we start with asking them to give us the names of all of the body parts. And it's really hilarious, and we all laugh at some of the terms that we come up with all over the world, but essentially kind of breaks down the nervousness and sort of the taboo of talking about sex in different cultures. Next slide, please. And we go through very extensive questioning about what happened to the person. We have bounding and anchoring questions that we sometimes add if a person says that they don't remember. I don't have the time to go into all of this, but this is what I train people to do, clinicians as well as researchers in all kinds of disciplines like psychiatry, public health, anyone who's doing studies that involve sexuality or clinical work that involves getting a sexual history has to know how to ask questions like this. Next slide, please. And of course, we have to ask men as well. If a trans woman comes in, but she's not had the surgery, then I will have to adjust some of these questions for her. But we do want to get an accurate history of what exactly she's been exposed to and what it is that she does. Next slide, please. These are just some more of the questions. They're very similar, but some male experiences are very different from those that women would experience. Next slide, please. Again, for men, we ask a number of questions. And sometimes we use anatomical charts if people are not sure, depending on the population. I always use anatomical charts when I go and do research in other countries, like in Jamaica, like in South Africa, just to make sure they understand what I'm saying, because I do speak with an accent to them. And so we want to make sure we're speaking to each other and we're looking and pointing at the same parts of the body. Next slide, please. So I did not intend to contradict the ACEs, but I want you to know that I do contradict them. I don't think that everyone has the same experiences that are traumatic in life, and ACEs is used worldwide, but it shouldn't be, because different groups have different experiences. And next slide, please. And I think we have to understand that we cannot take what's been standardized on a Kaiser middle class insurance-laden population of mostly white people who are working and use that everywhere and assume that we're going to pick up the same kinds of trauma in every single sample. We do that uniformly in psychology, and it's wrong. We just need to stop it. We need to take the time to ask people about their experiences, come up with either a modified version or a new version, because everybody doesn't have the same experience. How can you compare Black and white people? It just galls me. Nobody else has had 400 years of oppression, and then we're comparing them with people who haven't had. So it doesn't really make any sense as to what kind of conclusions that we come to when we find differences, because what are we basing those differences on? Anyway, I digress. Coming back to the UCLA life experiences screener. It's based on a range of experiences of trauma and adversity, and we found early family adversities and experiences of racial discrimination to be quite significantly different amongst African American and Latino, English and Spanish speaking men and women that we gave our screener to. Well, that just makes perfect sense to me, but not in our clinical training, not in any graduate school have I seen people have a course on how to ask about racial discrimination and what to do with it when someone reveals that they've had some kind of experience. It does not necessarily require CPD or all the other initials, CBT, that you give it. There's a whole different kind of questioning you ask about experiences of racial discrimination that begin with, first of all, what happened? When did this happen? How did you feel? What did you do? And you've got to know before you start to try to intervene in that particular situation and give them some way of handling and coping with the situation. Next slide, please. So we've done studies with over 500, now with 700 multi-ethnic groups of people. We asked about all of these kinds of experiences, many that are included in ACEs. Interestingly, though I wasn't even looking at it, nor did I really know that they were doing what they're doing, but they've gone back now and added a Black sample to try to be like my studies. And you know, if I ever did see the person who developed ACEs, I would tell them, no, you don't tag on people of color because you have temporal problems that you can't control for. So you just have to admit, you thought that white people could speak for Black people's traumas or people of color's traumas. And that's where your measure has its limitations, and you need to say that and admit it. That's what I'd say to them. I'd love to have that opportunity to meet them. Go on, next slide, please. Here's other measures, adulthood, childhood. When I started, people were using the age of 14 as the end of childhood. Why? What sense did that make? I use 18. That's the consensual age that you can make decisions about your body. And so we divide the experiences. Younger than 18, 18 and over. Adulthood is 18 and older. All of these experiences are assessed as well as mental health status. The outcomes that we use most of the time are depression and PTSD. Next slide, please. I'm looking at my time. We went through a number of analyses, and all of this is published and available if you'd like to see it. But we came up with 5 domains. Perceived discrimination predicted the symptoms of depression and PTSD more than child sexual abuse, which I would have argued with you, I would have found, but I didn't. Violence in the family, intimate partner violence, and fear that you might be killed or injured were the 5 domains that we found that best predicted. But perceived discrimination was number 1, the one that we don't teach about. I thought that was dynamic. Personally, I would have given myself an award. Next slide, please. We use confirmatory factor analyses to get these 5. It was quite a statistical procedure. And next slide, please. All of this is published. That's why I'm not spending a great deal of time with it. But let me just tell you something else that I don't do. I don't use the DSM-5 as my outcome. Why? Because first of all, most people don't even get a chance to get an evaluation, particularly people of color. They don't have insurance. Insurance is not going to pay for a psychiatric evaluation. So we use symptoms as our outcomes. If we can catch people upstream, this is our argument, before they get to the DSM-5 point, then we can teach them how to minimize the negative consequences of their stressful and traumatic experiences, rather than to wait for them to get this DSM-5 diagnosis many times. That doesn't include racial discrimination. Therefore, I have no love for it. You have simply got to ask about the experiences that have had a significant impact on people's development, their psychological well-being, their mental health and health. All right, next slide, please. These are the manuscripts that I'm referring to. They're easy to get, but if you have trouble, you can always let us know. Next slide, please. When we did some of these initial studies, I didn't have enough money to pay the interviewers for going out and doing face-to-face interviews. And so I went to various graduate programs at UCLA and out in the community, and I described what we were doing. I said that I would be willing if they volunteered to interview, and I could train them to write them letters for grad school. So I wrote many a letter. Most of these folks that you see in this picture are in grad school, and I am so proud. But they did the most fabulous interviews, and we actually published the whole process of training them to do interviews on trauma and stress, health and mental health. And it's nice to see that we were able to be a part of their education as well. Next slide, please. So I wanted to understand more about vulnerabilities. Next slide. And so we developed the critical vulnerability score, and we take a number of experiences that individuals have had over the many years that I've done research with cardiovascular health and mental health as outcomes. And we found that the higher the score, the more likely people are to do very poorly in interventions. They drop out, they break up in relationships, and also they don't change. Their behavior does not change as much. But these are really significant experiences that individuals have. They can't be, I think, overlooked. It is important for us to understand what poverty really means and what it really does to people. There's even a concept that we use called deep poverty, where people have absolutely nothing. Some of those individuals are able to change behavior, but these are the populations that I feel we need to include in research. That's where the problems in health and mental health kind of rest, because they're very difficult to get into studies. They don't come consistently. They may be high when they come. Oh, you meet a lot. Transportation problems are horrendous, especially in Los Angeles County. We have all kinds of problems, but that's the population that really needs help. We don't need help with educated populations, at least in my eyes. If we want to change the health base of America and the mental health base, that's what people basically have. We need to focus on the most vulnerable of people. Those are the people that some people in this United States don't want to have education. They don't want them to have health insurance. They don't feel they've worked hard enough to get it and are simply blamed for their poverty. I would love to meet those people. In fact, I meet them all the time. They will invite me to come and speak. And I think part of them probably wants to know, is there another way of dealing and helping people in this world? I argue, yes, there is, but you've got to know what your personal limitations are and why it is that you want to do this work. You can't be the Salvation Army. You have to look at it in an independent way, but make sure that everyone in your studies gets referrals or get mental health care or the health care that they need as a payment more than money, because those are the things that they cannot afford or get for themselves. Next slide, please. So there's some things that I've come upon over time that you might see as common in students. I see it a lot in patients, but these are the factors, 6 characterizations. What I mean, this is also published, shaped by structural racism. Next slide, please. And here they are. Healthy paranoia, which is just distrust and suspicion that people have to earn your trust. They don't just get it from wanting to talk to you or get to know you or so-called try to help you. Colorblindness is an attempt not to look at ethnicity, not to look at oppression, but just treat everyone the same. Just doesn't work. And it's disrespectful of a person's history. Of course, if I'm Black, I've always been Black. Love it every day, proud of it, but I want you to understand my history. I don't want you to ignore it. That doesn't help anything. It just makes it easier on the person trying to be colorblind. There are Black people, there are brown people, there are people of all ethnicities who are colorblind who don't want to deal with their own ethnicity. I also call that internalized racism. These are folks that would really rather hang with other groups than their own. I've seen them in therapy too. They didn't want to see me because they didn't think I was well trained enough to deal with them, especially because I went to a historically Black college and university. But by the time they're finished with therapy, I'm telling you, I got them. I know how to get a hook, and I know how to convince them that what they have been, the dose they've been taking is a dose to hate themselves, and that does not work. Anyway, there's a much bigger story to colorblindness. And I bet you can think in your mind right now of some people you know are colorblind, and you know some people who have internalized racism, and you recently saw them in the media, but I'm not gonna say any more about that. Duality is the next point I wanna make. Duality is the ability to understand there are many different ways of talking, dressing, expressing yourself with your body language, wearing clothes, and you have to know. And when I am around my people and I'm talking to people I'm comfortable with, and they don't all have to be Black, I know how to speak in dialect, and I'm comfortable doing it. I've spoken in dialect to you today because there's certain things I can't say in any other way. But that ability to switch is the label of for so many students and professionals today. Anyone that I supervise has to know how to dress when we go to receptions, and they have to know how to dress when we go into the community. You take all your bling off, you know, you blend in. If you don't know that and then that's not comfortable for you, then you ought not go. But you have to learn how to just be a person and how to look like a person and blend in. And you have to also learn how to walk with kings, queens of any type and any ethnicity. It's probably the most important piece of my growing up that my parents gave me. Here's the self-hatred that I've already talked about, but a lot of really significant damage comes from people who don't believe that they belong, don't think they're smart enough. That's the imposter syndrome. It used to be, the research was extended to women, but it's far deeper than just being a woman. It has to do with being a person of color, not being wanted, not being valued. Stereotype threat, which is people's attempt to be the contradiction of the stereotype. If people think, oh, Black people can't read, then you're gonna read everything. And the toll that they take and the tax that that places on you is sometimes so stressful and so heavy for students. They don't do well because they are pressuring themselves to try to be the example, the perfect one. And you know that person doesn't exist. Healthy paranoia is probably one of the best things that my parents also gave me, and that is to trust no one until they are worthy of my trust. That means I don't tell, and I did this morning, I told you some of my history. I don't, as I said, I don't do that for everyone, but I wanted you to know just how you look at a person, you can't tell what they've been through. You don't know their pain, you don't know what they've experienced, but they may act, you assume that it has something to do with you. It may have nothing to do with you. It has something to do with a trigger that occurred in the environment that has upset them, that has made them remember something that was very negative. They didn't feel appreciated. They felt less than. You see that imposter syndrome pops up, and they're reacting from that. Next slide, please. So I think it was Josh who asked me about cultural humility, and I did want him to know that I was listening. What do you do? What is it? You know, it's just that ability to be humbled, not to think that you know anything. And that's the first thing I would say that it entails. You don't know anything about anybody if they can't tell you. You only know as much as they'll tell you. They are the experts of their experiences. We know very little. And we're always humble enough to want to keep learning. I feel that way about any and everyone that I see. And I'm really grateful that my parents were those kinds of people who didn't have what I call an attitude just because they were well educated, and we were, and then our children. And anyway, we've got 5 generations now. We can't go back 5 generations, but we've got 5 now. And our task is to stay alive and thrive. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you finally how my parents did it. And you see the person, the ethnic identity and gender, the ethnic community, all of these pieces are extremely important in therapy. When you're trying to build a person's self-esteem, when you're working with adolescents, when you're working with teen moms, when you're working with survivors of domestic violence or sexual abuse, this is the piece that I work on. You'd say, golly, what does that have to do with them? It has everything to do with them, because these are not new experiences. These are things that have happened all through history. And we've tried different mechanisms, different interventions with them. And we know we can teach things. But the first thing that my parents taught me and that I teach in my interventions is history. What happened to people that gives you these behaviors that make me want to meet you and have you come into my groups? If we're talking about HIV, if we're talking about mental health, if we're talking about COVID now, what do we do with history? Well, of course, with COVID, it has to do with lack of access, and that this has been historic. So anyway, long story short, these are pieces that perhaps you don't think about. The worldview is also important. I want to know that there are 3 out of 4 people in this world that are brown. And you know that's what this election is all about. It doesn't have a thing to do with what people are talking about on the level we're talking. It has to do with the fact that everyone's going to be brown in about 20 years or less. And people don't want that kind of distribution of power in people that they feel are less than them. So don't let people fool you that you don't know. Don't let you come away from hearing me and think that you haven't been told what it all is about. And don't let you think that there's nothing that you can do to help people who look very different and who have absolutely nothing. Oh, yes, there is. You just simply have to know how to do it. You have to want to do it. You have to know that they are the experts of their experience. You have to fight for them and sometimes with them to raise them from where they are so that they can see a better day. Next slide. I want to thank my little mini team that stuck with me. We just finished a grant last weekend. I don't know how we did it, but we got this talk together. I had to think about it and I had to pray on it. So that I could tell you my story and I could tell you the truth. And I hope that it has had an impact on you this morning and that you don't forget. Thank you so much for listening.
I think we have time for some questions. We have a couple of minutes, so I want to be sensitive to Professor Wyatt's time, but if anyone has a question, please feel free.
Are we just freeballing questions or do we have to chat them?
I think you can freeball.
Please, I can hear you.
Okay, I have a question. Thank you for talking today. Really interesting to hear your story and how you got here. And my question is about healthcare. How do we, do you support a single payer healthcare system? And if not, what other ways do you see to remediate the healthcare disparities that we see in things like COVID among like ethnic minorities?
Well, you know, it's Rip Paul is your name?
Yeah.
Okay. Things have come back to roost, haven't they? Because if we'd had an individual payer system, we wouldn't have the kind of health crisis that we're getting ready to have, because everyone would have been able to go to their health provider and get whatever the testing They could have gotten treatment that we're developing as we go along. And as troublesome as that single payer system is, and I think it could use some tweaking and some changing. So I don't know all the answers, Paul. All I know is what we need to do is to see that everyone has a right to their own health. But it's just basic, and that the major resistance is that people have to pay for it. But we pay for everything anyway. If you ask me, what have I paid for? Don't get me started, Paul, because I come from a family that's had to pay, and we don't enjoy the wealth that many people are enjoying today because of my ancestors. So, you know, when you want to have that argument, and I know it's not you, you probably heard someone else talk about the single payer. Any westernized country that has a certain level of life has healthcare. If you don't have good health, you aren't anything. You can have all the money in the world, houses, cars, great kids, but if they're crazy or if they're in poor health, you know, if you've ever seen mental health, it can tear down a whole family. You know, everyone's scrambling, they don't know what to do, they're embarrassed, da 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 da. I bring the whole family in and we sit down and have a talk. Now look, this is John's problem, but John has a context. Did you see all those circles that I showed you? I believe in context. You create a net around people of love and support and understanding, they can do better. And I think that's what we have to create for every single person. Even those people living on the street have a history. They have a family. They're also disengaged with one another, and half of them are ashamed or not talking because of something that's happened in the family. We're going to have to take responsibility for each other. That's how this country started, taking responsibility for each other. Somehow we got sideways, you know, and I'd love to understand what happened to make people think that they could not do what they left Europe to do, and that they needed to go get somebody else to do it and treat them like they were animals for 250 of the years, and then add on top of that Jim Crow. My mother voted before she actually voted, she'd go and she'd, you know, fill out the little ballot. I mean, we were playing at her feet, and she'd give it to the person, and the person would put it on the side. She knew that that was never going to get in that box, but she voted because she wanted us to see that you vote. You don't miss it. That's a privilege. Well, so is healthcare. And I just think, you know, America could be so much better if I made sure that if you're going to be at a professional level, that you understand all these issues. Because that means you're going to be so much better, Paul, than you would be if you didn't have that information. Yes, is that Margaret?
Yeah, I was wondering, I was interested to hear a little bit more about how you ended up starting to do work in South Africa and what you see as the intersection of sort of what similarities and what differences you see in terms of the intersection of racism and mental health there and here, because they seem like both interestingly similar and interestingly different contexts. And
you answered the question. I was so blown away when I saw, have you guys been to South Africa? Anyone? I would take you all, Margaret. Margaret and I would take you all. I think it should be a part of finishing University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, is that they just pack you up and take you. Because I would not have to tell you about single payer. I would not have to tell you about the importance of health and mental health if you could see what I've seen. And I could not let it go, Margaret. I saw people who didn't have to live in townships anymore, but they lived there. Why? Because their context was there. And now, of course, they're dying because it's too close, you know, but there's been the effort to get people to enjoy their own country is it's the self-esteem is so low, and they're such lovely people. But when they come, you know, we have them come over to UCLA and their minds are blown. You know, aside from Disneyland, which they just got to do, we take them into stores. I take them into our homes. And, you know, they can't believe that my husband cooks because they're very patriarchal, you know, and I'm sitting down laughing and talking with them and he's cooking. And they'll say, well, how do you get him to do that? And I said, I married him. You know, he was like that. I married him. Or we had to come to an agreement. You know, it was going to be 2 careers. Well, that doesn't mean that we both would do the same thing. Whatever the one can do, they do. Those are the rules. But their country is very set. It still is. And when I saw that and I knew my history, I said, I can't go back and help 300 years ago, but I could help these people. And they have blown me away. Some of them are vice chancellors now. Some of them are rectors. I mean, all they needed was some self-esteem. I told them what I just shared with you. And what they saw, they said, well, are you colored? I said, you know, it's on my birth certificate. But my mother cleared that up right away, right? She said, it doesn't matter what color you are. It's how you identify. Which piece of you do you want to identify with? And I said, which piece do you want to identify? She said, well, I'm Black every day. I know my Irish ancestors. They all married the women that they had children with. Something about these people are really special. They didn't rape. So not everybody is a part of that whole nightmare. You know, there were families that were developed, but we don't ever hear about them, do we? You know, we don't really hear how people were hungry in one country and came over here and saw hunger here, and they got together and they made some really powerful people today talking to you all the way across the world. So, you know, we don't do what we should do. And I just felt like I had research skills. I told them, you know, you can call yourself colored, you can call yourself Indian, you can call yourself white, and you can say you're from Africa. But the real people are the Black South Africans. And you all ought to get rid of all these little terminologies that make you feel better, but they don't mean anything, because 99% of our genes, guess what? They're the same. I'm your cousin, Margaret, and you are mine. So if Paul doesn't get health care, I got to look out for him. If we started looking at ourselves and taking some of these artificial barriers away that were created by insecure people, we would be so powerful.
I think we have time maybe for one last question. We don't want to, we've already gone over time, and we don't want to take too much extra time.
I want you all to get out there and kick butt. You don't have to be Black to understand this story.
So Gail, I have to tell you, I saw you came to University of Georgia when I was in graduate school and spoke at the Institute for Behavioral Research, which I remember very distinctly. So it's fun to listen to you. And you talked a lot about having to buck the system in a number of different ways. I mean, everything from journals, returning your papers for not having control groups, to granting agencies. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to students in training about, you know, things that you would have done differently, or things that you are really proud that you did that maybe that they can learn from your experience.
By differently, do you mean mistakes that I made? I don't know your first name.
My name's Deborah, sorry.
Deborah,
no,
okay.
Choices that you made along the way that maybe weren't what the top journals in the field were looking for, but you did them anyway, it sounds like.
Well, just about everything I did was something that somebody had told me not to do, you know, from the K on down. Not publishing. I did wait to publish. I did want to honor the people who had helped me to get funded, you know, and they said if they find out you're funded, they'll fire me. I didn't want to hurt anybody. But, you know, at some point you have to follow what you think is right. I did have this healthy paranoia that said, you're listening, but you're not listening. You know, and I don't know how you learn that. Let me give you an example. About maybe 5-6 years into being at UCLA, they came to all the women and they said, well, we know you all have children and you know, you're busy, you're running to pick them up from school, you're coming back over here and doing this and that. Why don't you move to the adjunct series? And when you do that, you won't have as much pressure on you to publish. So all the women moved to the adjunct series except me. And if you talk to any of those women today, they will tell you how sorry they are. because then they slowed down their publications. It was hard to get back and ramp up that mania that it takes, you know, to get through and get tenure. And they were sorry. I talked to my mother and she said, don't you ever give up one series for another unless you just simply cannot do it. Now, there are times, I must say, that I should have given up. You know, my husband calls me very stubborn, bullheaded, that's the term, because I kept doing things and I should have given up earlier. But this was one that I was proud of. What they were trying to do was loosen up the academic system so they could hire more men. And once the women found out, they wanted to go back to the tenure series, and of course there was no room for them. So you got, that's where you don't listen. You know, part of you does and the other doesn't. And you've got to talk to a lot of people in order to do it. Just taking this job at UCLA where they wouldn't give me an orientation, I had no mentors and no one told me what I was expected to do. Wasn't that an invitation for me to drop out or get fired? But you know, I went around asking people and I found out what I was to do. And I asked them if they'd help me do it. And I went on by myself. So, I mean, my whole career is kind of made up with people who thought I wouldn't make it or didn't care if I did. And so what am I doing now? I'm trying my best to talk to young people and get them to have that same passion. Psychology is just a discipline. It's what we make it. And I think Emily said that we could make it better. And I believe that. You know, it's got that bandwidth that we can make better. But I just wanted you to know, I haven't done everything right. There have been people I hired who ended up being sociopaths. You know, I could go through all of that and I had to end up finding a way to let them go because, you know, they were really working against me, talking about me. And it was very painful because, you know, I'd invested in them. I saw the good, but I wasn't looking carefully enough at the bad, at the sick. I can't imagine what it would be to hear me years earlier and then hear me now. So, thanks for coming. I really enjoyed your warmth and your questions and just seeing your little faces. Margaret, I saw your baby.
Sorry, everyone. I thought I turned off my video. I apologize.
You did. I just saw her, him or her. It's been a good experience. I hope you you go forth and do well.